All right, namaste everyone. Welcome, welcome. We are jumping on with Susanna Barkataki. I'm so excited and looking forward to talking to her. We just had her on my live weekend training. So let me give you guys a second to jump on here. We just did there we go. We just did our live weekend training for the YPS 300 training, and Susanna came on and talked about cultural appropriation in yoga. So we are going to be diving into that. It is such a juicy topic. It is such a big topic. It is so needed. So let me see here. I'm just waiting for her to jump on and I will add her. So I'm curious right now, for those of you joining us, let me know if you are a yoga teacher, a yoga professional, if you're in the wellness world. I'd love to hear from you guys in the chat box. There we go. Yay. Awesome. Susanna. She's going to be jumping on here in a second. Hi.
Hi.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that glitch. How are you?
No worries. I'm so happy to be here. I'm really good.
I'm so happy to have you. So I was just saying to everyone, we just had Susanna on for the live training, live on Zoom, but we were doing our 300-hour teacher training, and Susanna was there teaching as a guest teacher. Obviously, your incredible book just came out, Embracing Yoga, not just, but in the end of last year, Embrace Yoga's Roots. And so we're talking about cultural appropriation in the yoga world, and I'm so grateful to have you, first of all, and I'm so grateful for your work that you're doing in the world.
Thank you, Ashley. It's great to be here, and it's so cool to see people join. This is exciting.
Everybody jumping on. Let's talk about just some definitions. Well, I'd love for you to just give a little background on your story, and then I'd love to talk about some definitions, because I know a lot of people are even, for me, even the word cultural appropriation is only new in the last few years. So it's really important for us to define those terms.
Yes. And so the reason I'll first say, because folks may not know me, but the reason that I care so much about cultural issues and cultural appropriation is because I'm Indian. My father is from Assam in the Northeast, which is a kind of a smaller, lesser known region near Bengal. And so my family is Assamese and Bengali, and then my mom is British. So I'm mixed, white and Indian. And I grew up at a time when folks like me were not wanted and were not, it just wasn't really a thing yet for people to mix and to kind of have interracial relationships. There was a lot of discrimination. And so I grew up being kind of put down for who I was as an Indian person in England and then later in the United States. And so those issues of separation and colonization and discrimination really were personal to me, because for the first part of my life, I was just and in the middle of my life, I started to study and try to understand, what are these things? Where is this coming from? Why is this happening? And that's what led me to studying things like colonial trauma, cultural appropriation, racism, systemic oppression, those types of things. So I like to give that background because it is personal, just like yoga is personal. And yoga was a way for me to come back to, probably for so many people listening and in your community, it's like a way to come back to myself and a way to come full circle. And for some of us, it might be because of trauma, it might be because of just life, might be racism, might be sexism, it might be, depression, all sorts of reasons. But that was my path to yoga as a tool for reconnecting with myself and not believing all of those things that had been told to me. So I'll define cultural appropriation in a second, but I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts or comments about that.
Well, I think it's so important to, it's interesting as, I think as a white person, it's so interesting to hear some of these terms and even the social justice sort of upheaval that we had, particularly in the United States last year. And it's easy to depersonalize it in a certain way. And that is part of white privilege, right? Is that I don't have to choose to pay attention to this in the same way that someone in a brown or black body is automatically every single day working with these issues, and it's informing your entire being, the way that you're, I'm a psychotherapist, so the way that your personality is even formed,
Yeah.
around systemic oppression. And that's, so I really love the emphasis on the personalization of it, that this is like, these are people's stories, these are people's childhoods, like how you were formed was inherently, and all of us, to varying degrees based on whatever we've gone through. But if you haven't, lived in systemic oppression or been in a marginalized community, I think it can be hard to understand. And like, keep in mind, like, this is a very personal, deep journey. And that's why it's so pressing. And it's crazy that it hasn't been more in the forefront than it is finally, in the last couple of years. But, the time is now. And especially, and we can talk about this as a big piece too, but the spiritual bypassing tendency of the yoga community, or thinking like, I'm not, doing anything wrong. Like, I'm not racist. I'm not, fill in the blank, because I love all people,
Right.
that piece. I want to talk about that piece too, but I really appreciate you starting from your roots,
Yeah. Yeah, it's true, because I think what people don't realize, and I'll talk about cultural appropriation in a second, but is for the very same things that someone else, like that you could do, Ashley, if you wore a bindi and,
Right.
talked about like your personal transformation with yoga, people would probably celebrate you and be like, oh my gosh, she's so exotic, she's so different, she's so cool. And when I do that in certain contexts, including where I live now in Orlando, Florida, I could be yelled at, I could be made fun of, I could even be physically harmed. I'm wearing a salwar kameez, which is like a traditional Indian outfit, and I can't wear this in my community without getting looks. Like, if I walk outside wearing the clothing that is the clothing I grew up wearing to go to puja, to go to different ceremonies, not every day, right? I grew up in the US, so I grew up wearing, shorts and jeans and shirts as well. But for puja, for ceremony, for times when we were doing traditional practices, this is the clothing I would wear, including sometimes a bindi. And I used to get, made fun of and even physically threatened. And so that's why cultural appropriation is an issue. It's because the very same things that someone from within the culture can do and then get made fun of or even harmed for, someone from the dominant culture can do, and actually they're seen as cool or different or cutting edge. And so that's why cultural appropriation is an issue. It actually is just pointing at systemic inequity.
Yeah.
And power imbalance. And so the definition really of cultural appropriation is stealing. It's like, it's not that complicated. It's like if I came to your house and I took something of yours and I didn't ask you, and then I benefited from it and didn't tell you about it and never like paid you back, right? Like, that would be really uncool. And I wouldn't do that, right? But we don't realize that when we're going into someone else's culture or tradition, that we might be doing that unless we understand and have a relationship with that culture. And it's not always that blatant as like direct stealing. Sometimes it's just like somewhat disrespectful. Like, for example, I have my computer up behind the phone because I like to actually give the exact definition of cultural appropriation. It's taking something from a culture that's not one's own. It involves privilege and a power imbalance plus harm to the source culture. The harm can be of disrespect and also material, cultural, economic, social, and spiritual harm. And so it can be cultural harm, not just like an insult, or like in the case of theft where it's material harm. It can be disrespectful. Like, I remember walking down the street in Venice Beach. I used to live and grew up in Los Angeles, and my Assamese and Bengali family are there. And I remember being in Venice with my aunts and uncles, and we're just, hanging out, walking. And there's so many shops as you're walking, beautiful view of the ocean. And then, I think you're not so far from there. And then there's all these shops, but sometimes there were shirts of like Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, holding a gun or holding a blunt. And my family would turn to me and be like, do they not understand that that's God, that's holy. Why would they do that to something that we personally connect to as the divine? So that kind of harm, cultural appropriation, can happen on that level of like deep, just like missing an opportunity to connect and also hurting someone from another culture.
And it's so, I think it can be so tricky. I mean, I honestly have only heard this conversation of cultural appropriation in yoga maybe in the last 5 years, maybe 10 years, but not, I don't remember this conversation at all happening 20, 25 years ago when I started yoga, and it really sort of got, yoga got, usurped or just sort of woven into this Western, what's the word I'm looking for? Just the marketplace, the sort, obviously the colonialism of it, but then just kind of taken as, I remember when I first started doing yoga 25 years ago, and there was a real emphasis truly on all the classes that I went to on the literature and on the, the roots of the philosophy and the spirituality. But then as it sort of really got popular in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was sort of watered down, and what would be the most popular, or how could we bring this more mainstream, if you will, and so there was this big shift. But regardless, I didn't see many Indian teachers. There were some, but not many,
Yeah, and that's the other piece that I really try to talk about, because this is a practice that has been practiced for thousands of years by brown people, right? By South Asians, and thousands of years, even if we conservatively say it's like 2,500 years. And so how could it be that so quickly as yoga moved to the West, that those people were erased from the center of sharing this knowledge? And I do think it's to do with colonialism and appropriation and white centering and other systems of power that really, to be clear, that's not about saying like white people shouldn't teach. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying what happened? How did we get from here to here? And what can we do now? Because in a way it's funny, like I was growing up in yoga culture through those years. But like you in Los Angeles, I looked around and I didn't see people that looked like my family teaching. And when I went to try to study yoga, I couldn't find any South Asian teachers. So I went to India to study. Not everyone can do that. For me, it was also like going home to visit my family, so there were other motivations and other reasons. But I think there's something we miss if we cut out the people from whom the practice comes, which doesn't mean that every Indian, like I want to be clear as well, every Indian or South Asian knows yoga. That would be tokenization. So for folks listening, don't just like walk up to your Indian friends and be like, tell me all about yoga. Because they might not have any clue. They might not have studied it. And actually part of and I'm really interested in your thoughts on this, Ashley, as a psychotherapist, because I am not a therapist, but I've studied like cultural issues for about 20 years. And so what I see is a kind of colonial trauma, both in Indians in India and actually those of us in diaspora like myself, where there's a reaction. I'm only one generation out from colonization. My father was born under British colonization, and then while he was a child, India became free, right? So it's very recent in terms of understanding trauma and how it passes down. And so many Indians in India and in the diaspora really look down on yoga, because it's like the British painted it as savage, as fringe, as and so here most of us, like I was told, be a doctor, be a lawyer, be a business person. Oh no, don't be a yogi. Like, what is that? That's not any kind of profession. So many Indians and South Asians and Desis, we carry this kind of almost shame about the spiritual traditions and the practices because of that colonial depiction of us as less than.
And I think that's really speaking to on a depth psychological level, you know, the collective unconscious and how we are, whatever culture you're born into, and then whatever culture you're raised in, you know, there's collective unconscious conditioning that's going in, whether we realize it or not. So to your point on the collective unconscious, or even the trauma of, you know, pinning something like yoga in the Indian culture as savage, or sort of a, you know, fringe kind of career and not a real legitimate profession, or certainly in dominant white culture, like there's so much to unpack there, but there's so much collective unconscious bias, or ways that we don't even realize we're thinking things, beliefs that we don't even realize we're thinking, preferences that we might have that are just baked in. As Hala said, you know, you were in our training on Friday, and then Hala Corey was teaching on Saturday, and said, you know, it's the water we're swimming in. You know, white supremacy and colonialism is the water we're swimming in. And I think the important thing for people to understand is that, you know, time's up. It's our generation, it's our inheritance all the way across the board, but it's our inheritance to make amends for. You know, maybe, yes, the people that committed true colonialism in that sense of, you know, dominating a culture physically or something in a certain way, certain people aren't, you know, here now, but we are, and we're still doing it. And what's important to understand is the systems that were created, the culture that was created is what we're living in. And that is doing so much harm. The systemic oppression on every level is doing so much harm. And it's up to us to change that. It's not up to anyone else. And so, you know, as a white person, we can say, I'm not racist, or I'm not this or that, or I never did anything, you know, I haven't. But we are creating harm because of the systems that we are participating in. And so until those systems change, they continue to do harm.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really is too, like for folks who are listening or watching, it's like the way we transmit yoga and who we bring in and who we uplift and whose books we're reading, you know, and who we're quoting, all of that is influencing the future generations and how yoga gets passed on. So I think people sometimes feel like they don't have that much power, but every single one of us has so much power in what we're doing and how we're doing it. And that's really why I wrote the book. It started out as like kind of this personal journey, an ancestral path of like telling my aunt and uncle's stories, telling my father's story. And then I submitted it to a publisher, and they were like, no, we're not going to publish this. Plus, you need to take out colonization. I was like, that's not going to work, but good point. This is too much story. And so it turned into a workbook because I wanted people to know the like how to identify separation, how to reflect on our part, how to take action to reconnect, and then how to pull it all together with a liberation practice themselves. So it wasn't like they had to rely on anyone else. Someone asked about the role of a guru. I think it's really different now. You know, the relationship in the West that we have with yoga, there have always been different paths. There's been, you know, the guru shishya path, which is a path that has been fraught with complication and also abuse, and we've seen a lot of that come out. And in my mind and understanding, and the stance I take, is if anyone abuses their teacher privilege, they completely no longer hold the role or the title of guru, and no one of us should have to speak their name or like put them on a pedestal. So that I'm very clear on. And there were always traditions that were counterculture. So even in India during the Guru Shishya time, there were, you know, rebel, Dalit, outcast yoga practitioners. There were women yoga practitioners. There were people teaching people in all different communities, not in that same kind of mold that I think we see as traditional. And even today, there are traditional Guru Shishya models, and a lot of them put down others, like my teacher, who was born a Brahmin, essentially has given up his status in order to teach in a small village in Bihar to the most the folks who wouldn't normally get access to yoga teachings, who are outcast folks and Dalit folks. And so, so someone like him would be looked down upon because he isn't following the sort of like the formal way that things are done. But again, there's always been different models. And so where I come in is to one say, yoga has always been pluralistic. It's always been, and really it's a conversation about not necessarily all agreeing, but the conversation of yoga can be, as Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, who's a yoga philosopher, contemporary philosopher, yoga can be a conversation on disagreement, on what we choose to disagree on. And it's always been that way. And so I would take more of the lineage of like critical thinking and asking questions rather than like following a guru directly, in part because of all the abuse that we've seen. And also because there is that rich tradition as well.
What would you say, so what are like at least some of the best practices? Like if someone's just tuning into this, you know, IG Live and IGTV and they're thinking like, whoa, I don't want to be misappropriating yoga. Like what can I do in my work to not create that harm?
Yeah, I mean, one, like really engage with the work, right? It's not, this kind of work isn't something that you can just like get right away or get overnight. I think it can take some time because, especially for white folks, I'll speak directly to white folks who might be on this call. Folks in positions of privilege can feel resistance, right? And it can feel like, oh my gosh, they're trying to take this thing away from me. Like, but it's mine and I've experienced so much benefit from it and I just want to share it and I want to do good with it. And all of that can be true. And at the same time, just because it's transformed you doesn't make it yours to do whatever you want with. So we have to give ourselves time when we're in positions of privilege to like sit with things and work with them and learn more. Because to truly not appropriate, you know, and not misappropriate would be to develop a deeper and deeper and deeper relationship with yoga itself first, right? So continue your sadhana, which I know is something you really encourage everyone in your community to do. So to develop and cultivate deep sadhana and to develop a relationship with the culture of yoga as well. So not just personal sadhana, but like South Asian culture. Once we're out of COVID, go to a temple, right? See what that's like. Doesn't mean you have to convert. Doesn't mean, you know, that like Hinduism's not even necessarily something you don't really convert, but just to develop an understanding and a relationship with the culture, to see the reverence with which people engage with the murtis, with the deities of yoga, with the practices, with the mantra. So, and then that's one, like developing relationship. Now you can read books by South Asian authors. There's so many more coming out right now. It's really an exciting time. There's a lot of us writing. Attend classes or workshops, like do continuing ed with folks from different backgrounds. And I'm trying to think. And then if there's places where you're like, I'm just not sure if this is appropriation or not, pause, right? Like trust that gut feeling and pause and say, okay, I've been saying this a lot lately, honestly, about things like, I need more information. I need more information. I need to learn more. And then Google it or look it up or, you know, take a class there's so many great classes right now on cultural appropriation because
well, you have.
I have a class, yeah. Embrace Yoga's Roots is a paid class, and then the Namaste Masterclass is a free class that goes pretty in depth.
That's namastemasterclass.com, right? I'm just gonna
namastemasterclass.com. Yeah. And that is a free class. It does let you know my paid class, so just full transparency there at the end, but it really goes into spiritual lineage acknowledgement, saying namaste and whether that's appropriative or not, what to consider, when and how you might say it, alternatives to saying namaste, right? And and then potential solutions.
Mhm.
So yeah, and I'm just looking through my notes to see if I have any other really specific, concrete things. I think the pause and learning more is really important, because when we rush in to do something, to lead a workshop, to, like, I don't know, decorate a space a certain way, we can maybe miss things that if we slowed down we could have caught. So I think slowing down, learning, and then also like trusting that as a culture, I think as a yoga culture in general, yogis are people who want to do things well. Like, we want to grow, we want to learn, we want to do things right. And so maybe turning to your community and having conversations with other people as well. And I will say again, I brought up tokenization before. Don't go to your friends of color, again, talking to white folks, and be like, can you teach me about if this is right or wrong? Not like that, right? Like, unless you're hiring them to be your equity consultant, but maybe with your colleagues and friends at a studio or teachers that you've had, you can just say, have you thought about this? What do you think of this book? What do you think of this article? And have more of a discussion. And then when you're ready, you can go and take, classes or learning that are more formal.
And I definitely recommend, obviously, Susanna's book, but also her class, Namaste Masterclass, and then her paid class. Is that you had, because I saw you had a class with Off the Mat. Do you have another class on your own, or is that?
I do, yeah. So the main class that I run it's Embrace Yoga's Roots. So it's the same, it's actually like the class that's, let me grab my book. It's the name of it's going to be backwards.
Yeah.
It's so funny how it does that. But the class name is the same name as my book name, and it takes everything in there and really like brings it alive for yoga teachers, so they can see how to put these things into practice in their classes, in their studio, in their workshops, have conversations, really just like takes it deeper. I like to learn in different ways, and so for me a book is good, but I often read a book and then like to take a live workshop with people. So that's why I made the class.
Yeah, the interaction, of course.
Yeah.
I think that for any of you that might be watching, and I say this because we were in, as I mentioned, we had my 300-hour live training this weekend, and Susanna was our first guest teacher, which was so amazing to start from this place. And to be fair, a lot of students that come to my courses are white or white presenting, the majority. And we're really working on changing that and shifting that. And there's several actions, to be taken, and it's a process. But we saw in the comments, that this was a newer conversation for a lot of people. And as I said, for myself, this has been a newer conversation just in the last 3 to 5 years. So, I certainly feel like I'm very much at the beginning stages of understanding my own white privilege and my own internalized racism and systemic oppression as it exists, particularly in the United States. But this is not, this is not short term. This is not like you're going to just take a 6-week course and then like, okay, I got that one, check the box, especially for people in dominant cultures. And I'm really talking to the white folks watching and listening. This is extremely deep shadow work for us to do. And it is our responsibility, as Susanna said very politely, like, it's not for us to go to people of color, brown and black people, and ask, hey, can you tell me about this? Or, what do you think? And it's really for us to take the initiative and find the inroads and the sources. And yes, it's about connecting with teachers and understanding, like really doing education. But I think even the bigger work is the deep personal shadow work. And, it's so complicated and it's so messy. And I guess the point I want to make is that it's ongoing. Like, this is our lifetime's work. Like, truly, this is just beginning in our culture. And we have to come to terms, as a white person, like, I've really had to get with my shame and get with like, whoa, this is a horror that people like me have inflicted across the planet, you know, for thousands of years, for hundreds of years. And we have to take ownership of that. You know, we have to somehow begin to make amends with that, and then see systems that we haven't even, you know, it's like one of my friends, Masood Ali Khan, who I know, you know, Sienna's Sherman's partner, who is also Indian and British. And he said, Sienna and I were talking to him about this, and he said something about like, you know, once you start to see it, you can't unsee it. And then it's like everywhere you look, you see systemic oppression. Like once you start to tune into it, it's like, oh my God, like I can't even believe I wasn't seeing this before. And it's so everywhere. And it can, you know, it's a lot, you know, but it's like such a, I guess for me, you know, it's just been, it's embarrassing that the awakening has come so late, you know, and that's part of the, I guess that is part of the white privilege. So I really want to speak to those of you who this is a newer conversation for, and I cannot implore enough to please start doing this work on your own personally, with groups, get that reflection from other people, and start taking action and really committing to change. And it's ongoing. It is not, you know, this is for the rest of our lives, we're going to be working with this. You know?
Right. My colleague and friend, you might know, Teo Drake.
Yeah.
He is a trans yoga teacher and activist, and he says something like, when you step into a little more discomfort, you in a position of privilege, you allow me to step into a little more ease. And I often think of that because it's interesting while you're talking, and for folks, you know, the folks of color listening, and for myself, it's like you're talking about all that time that you weren't aware, but I was.
Right.
You know? So
exactly.
like,
my point exactly.
Where, like it's not a new conversation. It's an old conversation, and in some ways a painful one. And I will say I'm light skinned, right? I'm mixed, so I have a good amount of privilege myself, and that's in part one, why people listen to me. Let's be real, right? But two, why in some ways I think it's possible for me to have the conversations that I have in the way that I have, because I'm less threatening to dominant culture. And so I would also say to watch for subtle biases like that. And that's why, like, when you see me do stuff, or like in the trainings I run, I always have many teachers, other South Asian teachers, right, of all different backgrounds and experiences, Black teachers, right? It's because I know my job as I'm doing this work is to uplift myself, sure, but so many other people. And so for folks in positions of privilege, the work is also to like unpack those internalized biases that we might not even realize we have while we're doing this work. But I'm really curious too, Ashley, like in the YTT, because I did come in on the first day and then you had Hala the second day. What was the reaction? Like, what were some of the things that students were struggling with, or like overall, was it received? Was it not? You know, I'm just so curious.
Oh, it was definitely so well received, of course. And I think, you know, it was so well received, and I think people were really grateful to be entering, you know, this was our first weekend training together, and that we were starting with this conversation because it is such an important one. It's really pivotal. And there was a lot of white fragility, and there was a lot of, you know, white, I guess it's the white privilege, you know, for sure, but the white fragility and thinking, which I really recognize, because this is exactly what happened to me. You know, when I first started getting called out on this stuff, and, you know, to be totally transparent, Susanna called me out on stuff, and I really appreciate that, you know, and it's like, whoa, once again, I thought I was already kind of doing some good work. And then once again, it's like, no, there's more layers to go. And so the first time, you know, well, not just the first time, but, you know, I definitely checked every box of white fragility. I had never even heard of white fragility, you know? And so, again, privilege, right? And so when it's like, I'm not being defensive, I'm just saying I'm not prejudiced. And people were like, oh my God, you don't even understand what you're doing right now. You're being defensive, you know? And and then later I remember I saw like a PDF online of like, what is white fragility? And it was literally like, I could check every single box of exactly what I did. Like, it's so, it's so sort of automatic, like the defense. And when you understand psychologically, it's like, oh, that was my ego persona trying to defend itself. Like, I'm not that, but yet that's exactly what I am. So there was some of that happening in the training. And so I think that's another reason I really wanted to be on here with you on an Instagram Live and continue to go deeper, to really presence this for people and have these difficult conversations and hold up the mirror and say, if you're a white person and you're saying, I'm not prejudiced, I'm not biased, you need to look a little further, because there are things that the way that we're conditioned, the way that we're taught to be educated. I think I told you one thing that, for example, concrete example for you all watching, when I was asking one of my colleagues about this, who's an African-American teacher, and Rolf Bates, and I said, well, Rolf, like, what would you recommend? Like, what are things that I can do? And he said, well, who are the required readings in your training? Like, what books are you required or recommending people read? And do you have any written by people of color, by South Asians, or by African Americans, or brown and black people? And I was like, whoa, that's a great reflection. And no, I don't, and when Sienna and I first got called out, we were putting on a summit, and people called us out for it not being diverse. We only had, I think 1 or 2 people out of, let's say, 20, 25 that were not white presenting. And we had said, and we had very clearly, this is how, like, blinders we had literally made the decision, oh, well, we want to, invite teachers that we personally have studied with, like, we know their work. And so then when it all kind of blew up, we were like, oh my God, we haven't studied with very many people of color. And like, what is that saying? Like, that's us not taking the initiative and seeking out diverse voices and diverse perspectives. And that was a huge wake-up call for both of us. I don't want to speak for her, but for myself, it was a huge wake-up call. Like, that is white privilege, when you're not even aware of the things that you're doing. You're not even aware that you don't have diversity in your world, in your sort of first tier. So that was a big example. And to have, we had some people on the training that were asking, like, what is an affinity group? Why would we need to have a small group on the training that's just for black and brown people or BIPOC people? And it's because they need a safe space to process. And when we're processing as white people, the stuff that we're talking about, it can be very painful to hear again. And they don't want to be privy to that. You don't need to be in that conversation. Like, it's, as you said, it's not a new conversation. It's an old conversation. So it's kind of like, fuck you, honestly, like, get over it. Like, get over your,
Yeah. Or, I mean, cause I have so much compassion too. It's like, have the conversation, but don't have it at my expense.
Or don't expect, I don't need to be there for your conversation.
Right.
I don't need to be a part of it. That's your conversation to have with other people and process in that way. But for sure.
That's really interesting. And it's great, because we do need more spaces like this and more like white folks, because I also want to acknowledge, and someone else put it in the chat, is like the transparency, and also talking about when you've been called out and how you move forward and what you've done. I mean, it's like, for me, when I've been called out for stuff somatically, it's really disruptive. Like, it's hard to sleep, it's hard to eat, I feel really anxious. And yet what I've learned, and I know that sounds terrible, right? So for folks listening, it's like, that might happen. And what's important, I've learned, is just re-regulate and then still show up for the conversation, even when I've made a mistake. Or, sometimes there's times when I've been called out when I listen, I take the feedback, I go through my process and I'm like, thanks for the feedback. And I don't fully agree with that feedback. Like
Right.
I get called out sometimes by Hindu fundamentalists who are mad at me for saying that you can teach yoga when you're not a Hindu. Well, I truly believe that yoga is for everyone and not just for Hindus. So I'm
Mhm.
okay with those folks being mad at me. But it still hurts when I feel
Yeah.
like there's a misunderstanding, right? So just to say for people who are like, wow, you went through that and you got called out. And it's sometimes part of doing this work and that process of being willing to stay at the table and to stay in the
Yeah.
conversation.
No, that's such a good point. And, I'll speak to there were a couple different times when I've been called out, and I'm sure many more times when I've been criticized that I'm not so aware of. But the two times, especially the one with our Urban Priestess Summit, which was sort of a public, in the yoga world, like there were a couple threads on Facebook that got a lot of traction. And, when you're sort of on the chopping block and you're like, whoa, like it's all sort of focused. And then it just got really messy. But that's actually part of it, and one thing that you said about definitely it was dysregulating. Definitely, I was spun into depression. I mean, it was a serious few weeks there where I was really underwater and like, whoa, this is so uncomfortable. I'm so ashamed. I'm angry. I hate the culture that, we've created, and there's so many mixed emotions. But you're absolutely right that the work is to self-regulate and to do my practices and to seek support seek guidance from people that had been through it before and had much more insight. Definitely to start, hiring DEI. Teo is one of them who I've worked with closely, was amazing and in guidance in that. Um, and to still keep showing up, and one thing for me as a white person that I kept thinking about and I actually was having almost like transmission because I was having dreams, and as you said, I couldn't sleep. I was having insomnia, like pretty serious, because this collective trauma was stirring up within me. Like it had been pointed at and identified within me. And I kept thinking like, wow, I don't even know that I had the word for white privilege at that point, but it was like, wow, if this is all I have to experience, a few weeks and then different, ripples of that. I've never had to experience that kind of persecution or hatred in my whole life. And this is the first time that I'm really experiencing like, anger, hatred, like, like ferocity towards me. Imagine what people in brown and black bodies, imagine what, slaves in America have experienced back, hundreds of now, just all the people that have been persecuted against. And so I really felt like I was channeling some of that and like, wow, this is so minuscule compared to any kind of, amount of harm that people who've been persecuted have experienced. And like, you better be able to like regulate and then keep showing up for this. And that's part of the contract, if we really believe in soul contracts and sacred contracts as a white person, to help further this conversation. And how do we help do this? And I know I'm still making mistakes. I'm sure I've already made microaggressions on this call. It's like, I know that that's part of it. I know that there's a lot of things that I don't know still and will
Right,
never,
right.
but we have to be courageous to keep pressing forward and to lean into this.
Yeah, and with yoga too, I mean, yoga is unity. And so part of what I believe what we're agreeing to when we say I'm signing up to be a yoga teacher or even a yoga practitioner is to move towards that unity, both personally and then also socially, collectively, to
Mm-hmm.
stand for that and to do what we can to work against things that separate us and to do everything we can to bring more unity, not in like that bypassing way of like we're all one, right? But because ultimately, of course we are, right? Yes, but there's so much in place, so many systemic issues that keep us separated in the kind of phenomenal world that we live in, that our job as yoga practitioners is to stand against those things that separate us. Or another way of looking at it is to work to understand and to connect to, and then kind of like love love our way towards true unity. Depends on if you think of yourself more as like a warrior or more as a love, a love bringer and a light bringer. Either way, I think it's the same mission that yoga is here for, which is understanding the causes of separation and then moving us towards true unity, not like some kind of false idol of unity.
Yeah. And I will say that one of the biggest boons of, my own personal experience sort of being called out is that, this is a perfect example with you, with other couple people, especially that happened a few years ago. I think it was 3 years ago when we had this thing with our Urban Priestess Summit. One of the girls in particular who was kind of driving that thread, and in a way, sort of, so to speak, attacking us, but it was rightful. Truly, it was okay. Like her claims were right on. It was aggressive, but months later, we ended up having a healing around it. And it really was an opportunity for all of us to, both of us to really say, wow, like, and let's come together and like, we need to be able to argue in a healthy way. We need to be able to have uncomfortable discussions that can even, in psychology, we talk about when there's a rupture in a relationship, it's actually the greatest opportunity for intimacy. And because if you can repair that rupture and if you can both find ways to, seek amends and, find those inroads, you actually can create much more intimacy, more unity, And I feel that with yourself, I'm really grateful that we can be having these conversations and joining in some kind of work together and collaboration to whatever degree. And even though, honestly, it started as like you calling me out and I was like, whoa, oh goodness. And it got, sort of uncomfortable there. And yet when you step back, can you step back in and say, okay, you're right. I really want to understand. I want to learn more. I want to do better. I want to like, let's connect, So this is the invitation, for healing. And this is the invitation for being uncomfortable and letting that discomfort guide us into the next, phase and into more unity.
Yeah. And just noticing too, like, there may be people we encounter who call us out in ways that then they hold space for like grace and repair. And I was just talking to a mentor teacher in the training I run, who's a Black woman, and she was saying like she gets called aggressive all the time, and so she has to watch what she says and how she says it and her tone. So there may even be the folks who call us out who we might feel are being aggressive, and they don't ever want to come back and have the repair.
Right.
And that's okay too. Like that's part of when we're in positions of privilege. And I really do a lot of like in the training I did with you, looking at the wheel of power and privilege and how all the places where we exist in proximity to power, like, if someone's white or cisgendered or straight, or has class privilege, like all those ways, there may be folks on the margins who never want to come back into relationship, and we have to just say, thank you for the feedback, thank you, and take it into account. And for the folks who do, great, and understand that sometimes our privilege blocks us from seeing the realities that folks who are marginalized are living with and have lived with their whole lives. And so to have that empathy, I think, is huge.
No, absolutely. And you just kind of called me out because I did mention that this person, was aggressive, but in the sense that, but is that aggressive? It's like, oh, I just realized that was my white privilege of like, don't, that sort of white fragility of like, don't be so aggressive. And we had a lot of sort of our followers that were like defending us. And then we're like, no, you don't need to defend us. Like, it's true. We need to be called out. It's okay. And that is part of white privilege of like, don't talk to me like that. I'm not trying to do anything wrong. And that's a whole other topic, but I'm thanking you for pointing that out because you just mentioned that. And I was like, oh yeah, that's my perception, that she was being aggressive when she was sort of honest. But at the same time, I wonder how much we would have heard if it wasn't that aggressive.
Oh my gosh. I think of that all the time when I
don't think we would have paid attention the same way if it wasn't so kind of like with force,
Yeah. When I'm putting my kid, I have an 8-year-old and it's like, go to bed now, go to
Right.
bed, stop reading. And then I'm like, dude, it's 10. If you don't go to bed, I'm
Yeah.
gonna have to get mean. And until I get mean, he doesn't listen. It's like,
Yeah.
what is it somehow in us that we need that forcefulness? But yet I think sometimes we can take the sweeter path, right? Give it or receive it
Yeah.
with a different
And
energy.
to not have judgment around that, you know, it's all,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I am so grateful. Is there anything else you want to leave everyone with, or sort of a nugget, or?
You know, just to stick with it, right? I know this conversation, for those watching now or watching the replay, it might make you uncomfortable, and really listen, continue listening, listen the whole way through, pick up the books, listen to the workshops, like keep at it, keep with it. For folks of color who are on the call or in the communities, like, we get to speak up, we get to take up space, you know, and to ask for what we need, and ask for our stories and our experiences to be centered. And so also to, you know, one of the things I love to do is support other folks. So I'm available especially for folks of color, to reach out to me and be like, hey, can you uplift this thing that I'm doing? I'm happy to do that. And then also, just the way we would with our practice, like have the sadhana of, you know, your asana, the personal practice of your yoga, you know, physical mat practice, and then also meditation and the different kinds of practices we might have, but also have your ahimsa practice, because really your yoga ethics, this is yoga ethics. This is a practice of non-harm and of care, personal care and cultural care.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, definitely check out all of Susanna's work, and definitely read her new book, Embrace Yoga's Roots. Check out namestemasterclass.com. We'll have all the links right below in the caption as well. And I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for your colleagueship and being here in conversation with you and all the work that you're doing. It's just so incredible.
Thank you, Ashley. Really
Yeah.
grateful for you too.
Yeah. Thank you all. Please let us know in the comments if you have any questions. We will keep this conversation going. Be well. Thank you.